Last topic that we'll be discussing today will be sex chromosomes and sex-linked genes. Remember how we talked about how there are autosomal genes and there are sex-linked genes? Well, in mammals, the sex chromosomes are X and Y. Other animals use different systems for sex determination, and thus have different types of sex chromosomes. For example, oftentimes in insects, if you have 2 copies of the sex chromosome, you're female. If you have 1 copy, you're male. In chickens and other birds, it's backwards. The homozygotic sex, the one that has 2 copies of the same chromosome, is male, whereas in humans it would be female, and vice versa. And in bees, it's the number of chromosomes. If you're diploid, you're female. If you're haploid, you're male. Now, that's a lot of different things to remember, so for us, we're only going to be doing genetics for things that are like us. A gene that is located on a sex chromosome is called a sex-linked gene. For our purposes, this is mostly going to be genes located on the X chromosome, and that's because the Y chromosome contains very few genes. So let's talk about an example. The gene for this trait is located on the X chromosome. So let's see what happens when we do a cross. The first thing we need to do is we need to talk about the relationship between these genes. So red is dominant to white, and we're going to assign the R allele. Capital R is going to be red, lowercase r is going to be white. Notice that the way I've written it here is as a superscript. This is important. The Y chromosome does not confer anything for this phenotype, so you will be likely to want to leave it out. If you don't put the X there, you might consider that you've forgotten something, or you might forget and treat this like it's autosomal. So please use the superscript. It will help you. In the first version of this cross, we're going to have a female who is homozygous for the red-eyed trait, and a male who has white eyes. Males cannot be homozygous or heterozygous for these traits under normal circumstances. Notice how he only has one X. Whatever X he has is what he's going to look like. Unlike with autosomal traits, for sex-linked genes it matters which parent has the dominant phenotype. So in this example, the female can only give dominant X's to all of her children, and the male can either give a recessive X or a Y. This means that all of the children of this cross will have red eyes, because the female gives an X chromosome to both her daughters and her sons. The females will be heterozygous, and the males will only carry the dominant X and a Y. So when a true breeding female has the dominant phenotype, all of her progeny will look like her. Now let's consider the reciprocal cross. In this situation, the male has the dominant red eye color and the female is true breeding for the recessive color. The female will still give a recessive X to all of her children, but half of the children will receive the dominant X from the male. These will be his daughters, and the Y, these will be his sons. This means that the females will be heterozygous and will have red eyes, but all of the sons will only have the X chromosome from their mother and they will have white eyes. This is a 1-to-1 ratio. That is different from what we would expect to see in a cross for autosomal traits. So when the female is true breeding and has the recessive phenotype, all of the male progeny will look like her and all of the female progeny will look like their father. Most X-linked human disorders are due to recessive alleles and are therefore seen mostly in males. A male that receives a single X-linked recessive allele from his mother will have the disorder. A female has to receive 2 alleles, one from both parents, to be affected. An example for this is something like hemophilia. Hemophilia is an X-linked trait that was relatively common in a lot of royal families. For example, Queen Victoria here was a carrier, and so were her daughter and her granddaughter. Her granddaughter Alexandria was the first to have a male sire, and that was Alexei, and he had hemophilia. There are some basic rules about X-linked recessive traits. They are always passed on from the mother to her sons and daughters, but they are passed from fathers only to their daughters. They are never transmitted from father to son. This is because fathers do not give X chromosomes to any of their sons. Females can be carriers, so these traits are more common to be seen in males, and unaffected females can pass them on to an affected son or an unaffected daughter. Examples of this are going to be things like hemophilia, muscular dystrophy, and color blindness. So if we want to put that as a pedigree, you can see in this particular pedigree that the only individuals that are affected are male. Those would be our solid red boxes. But not all males are affected. For example, if we look at individual 3 in generation 2, we see that none of his children have this disease. If his sons had it, it would be a Y-linked trait, but because they don't, this is an X-linked recessive trait. X-linked dominant traits tend to behave a little differently. An example of that would be Calvin-Lowry syndrome. These are expressed in heterozygous females who can have the disease, and usually no males will have it. This is because dominant traits like this tend to be a lot worse in males, where it is the only X available. So if you see a pedigree where most people who are affected are female, and there are individuals affected in every generation, it's probably dominant and X-linked. Y-linked traits tend to be passed down from males to their sons. This means that every male in the pedigree, if they have a father who is affected, will also be affected. These kinds of traits are relatively rare, but they do occur. This summarizes pretty well the types of inheritance that we've talked about today, with the exception of incomplete and codominance. It's really important that you get experience working on these kinds of problems. Genetics is not the kind of material that you can just memorize. I've included on Canvas some practice problems and a key for answering these problems, as well as an extra credit activity which helps you break down word problems like the kind you might see on your test. Students who do the practice problems tend to do 1/2 to 1 full letter grade better on the final exam than students who don't. If you're still having trouble, please come to office hours and let me know.